He was 11 years old when he became a king. He lost his kingdom 3 times before he turned 20. He spent years sleeping in caves, eating whatever his men could steal, leading fewer than 300 followers through mountains in the dead of winter. His name was Babur, and by every measure, his life should have ended in obscurity, a failed prince forgotten by history. Instead, his grandson would go on to rule over 100 million people, more than the entire population of Europe combined. He would build an empire so wealthy that European travelers literally could not believe what they were seeing. And he would do something almost no ruler in human history had attempted. He would try to build a religion that contained every religion at once. This is the story of how a defeated, homeless prince became the great-grandfather of an empire so powerful it would dominate the Indian subcontinent for the next 300 years. This is the rise of the Mughal Empire. In the city of Fergana, in modern-day Uzbekistan, an 11-year-old boy named Zahir ud-Din Muhammad inherits his father's throne after a sudden death. His name would later become Babur, the tiger, but there was nothing tiger-like about his situation. He was a child ruling a small, unstable kingdom surrounded by older, more powerful relatives who all wanted what little he had. He was a direct descendant of 2 of the most feared conquerors in human history, Timur on his father's side, Genghis Khan on his mother's side. Royal blood ran through him on both sides. But blood does not win wars. Armies do. For the next decade, Babur fought constantly just to survive. He captured the great city of Samarkand, the former capital of his ancestor Timur, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And he lost it 3 separate times. By his early 20s, Babur had been completely defeated. His enemies controlled his homeland. He had no kingdom, no real army, and barely any followers left. Most historical accounts agree. At his lowest point, Babur was leading a band of fewer than 300 men through the mountains of Central Asia with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Most people in this situation give up. Babur did something else. He looked south. In 1504, with his homeland lost, Babur captured Kabul in modern-day Afghanistan. It was not the great empire he had once imagined for himself, but it was something, a base, a place to rebuild. For the next 2 decades, Babur ruled from Kabul, rebuilding his strength, recruiting soldiers, and watching the political situation in the region around him. And he kept hearing about something to the south, a land of unimaginable wealth, fertile plains, rich cities, and, crucially, a fractured, weak political situation ripe for the taking. Northern India was controlled by the Delhi Sultanate, ruled at the time by a sultan named Ibrahim Lodi. The Sultanate was wealthy but unstable. Lodi had alienated many of his own nobles through harsh and arrogant rule. Several of them had actually started reaching out to Babur, inviting him to invade. Babur did not need much convincing. He had spent 20 years rebuilding after losing everything. Now he had an opportunity most conquerors only dream of, an invitation to invade a wealthy kingdom whose own nobles wanted it to fall. In 1526, Babur crossed into India with an army that, by most accounts, numbered somewhere around 12,000 to 15,000 men. He was about to face an army many times that size. April 1526. The plains of Panipat, north of Delhi. Sultan Ibrahim Lodi marched out to meet Babur with an army historians estimate between 100,000 men and, by some contemporary accounts, even larger, supported by as many as 1,000 war elephants. Babur had somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 men. By every traditional measure of warfare, this should not have been close. Babur was outnumbered by what could be a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. But Babur had something Lodi's army did not: gunpowder weapons, and a tactical innovation almost nobody in India had seen executed at this scale. He arranged his wagons and carts into a defensive barrier, a tactic he had learned from Ottoman warfare, called araba. Behind this mobile wall, his matchlock gunmen and field cannons were positioned with clear lines of fire. The Lodi army, accustomed to traditional cavalry charges and elephant assaults, had no real answer for coordinated gunpowder volleys fired from behind a fortified wagon line. When Lodi's massive force advanced, Babur's gunners opened fire. The unfamiliar sound and impact of cannon fire reportedly panicked the war elephants, causing them to turn and trample their own soldiers. Babur's flanking cavalry, meanwhile, swept around the sides and attacked the disorganized Lodi army from behind. The The battle lasted only a few hours. Ibrahim Lodi died on the battlefield. His massive army collapsed into chaos and fled. Babur, the homeless prince who had lost his kingdom 3 times, had just defeated an army roughly 10 times the size of his own and conquered Delhi. He was now the ruler of northern India. The Mughal Empire had just been born on a single battlefield in a single afternoon. Victory at Panipat did not mean peace. Babur spent the next 4 years fighting to hold what he had won, facing rebellions from Afghan nobles and a major confrontation against a powerful Rajput confederation led by Rana Sanga at the Battle of Kanwa in 1527, which Babur also won decisively, again relying heavily on his gunpowder tactics. But Babur's time was short. He died in 1530, just 4 years after Panipat, at the age of 47. He left behind an empire that was barely a few years old, financially unstable, surrounded by enemies, and inherited by his son Humayun, a man widely regarded by historians as kind, cultured, and intelligent, but lacking his father's military instincts and political ruthlessness. Within 10 years, Humayun would lose the entire empire his father had built, driven out of India entirely by a brilliant Afghan rebel named Sher Shah Suri, forced into exile in Persia for over a decade. The Mughal Empire, born in a single afternoon at Panipat, nearly died just as quickly. And then, in exile, in 1542, in the desert city of Yamarkad, Humayun's wife gave birth to a son. His name was Akbar. Akbar was born into an empire that, at the time of his birth, did not technically exist. His father was in exile. His family had nothing. In 1555, after 15 years of exile, Humayun finally managed to retake Delhi with Persian military support. But barely a year later, in 1556, he died after a fall down a staircase in his library. Akbar became emperor at the age of 13. Here is something almost nobody knows about Akbar. He never learned to read or write. Historians have debated the exact reason for centuries. Possibly dyslexia, possibly the simple fact that his chaotic, war-torn childhood left no room for formal education. Whatever the cause, the man who would go on to build one of the most intellectually vibrant courts in history could not personally read a single book. Instead, he built an extraordinary memory. He had books read aloud to him constantly. Historians estimate his royal library contained tens of thousands of manuscripts, and Akbar reportedly knew the content of an enormous number of them by heart, simply through listening. A 13-year-old boy, illiterate, inheriting an empire that barely existed, surrounded by powerful regents and advisors who assumed they would actually be the ones in control. They were wrong. Just months into Akbar's reign, a powerful Hindu general named Hemu, who had seized Delhi in the chaos following Humayun's death, declared himself king and assembled a massive army to crush the young, vulnerable Mughal regime before it could even establish itself. In 1556, at the exact same battlefield where Babur had founded the empire 30 years earlier, Akbar's forces, led in practice by his regent Bairam Khan, since Akbar was only 13, met Hemu's army at the Second Battle of Panipat. Hemu's forces were initially winning the battle decisively. Then, in one of history's stranger turns of fate, Hemu was struck in the eye by an arrow and fell unconscious. His massive army, suddenly leaderless and confused, collapsed into panic and fled. The Mughal Empire, which had nearly died with Humayun, had just survived its second existential threat at the exact same battlefield where it was born. Akbar was 13 years old and had already survived what should have ended his dynasty. He would spend the next 4 decades transforming a fragile, contested kingdom into one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated empires the world had ever seen. As Akbar grew older and took direct control of the empire, he faced an obvious problem. He ruled over a population that was overwhelmingly Hindu, while his Mughal dynasty was Muslim, foreign in origin, and surrounded by powerful Hindu Rajput kingdoms that had resisted Muslim rule for centuries. Most conquerors in his position would have ruled through pure military force and religious dominance. Akbar did something almost nobody expected. He began forming marriage alliances with major Rajput Hindu royal families, not as conquests, but as genuine political partnerships. His most famous marriage was to a Rajput princess from Amber and Rajput nobles were given genuinely powerful positions within the Mughal administration and military, not as token gestures, but as real generals and ministers with real authority. His most famous Rajput general, Raja Man Singh, became one of the most trusted military commanders in the entire empire. Akbar abolished the jizya, the tax historically levied on non-Muslims in many Islamic states, making Hindus and Muslims equal taxpayers under his rule. He banned the practice of forcibly converting prisoners of war. He even reportedly observed and participated respectfully in Hindu festivals at his own court. This was not weakness. It was strategy of the highest order. By making Hindus genuine partners in his empire rather than conquered subjects, Akbar built something far more stable and durable than military conquest alone could ever achieve. Genuine loyalty across religious lines, at a scale almost no ruler in that era had attempted. Akbar's curiosity about religion went far beyond political strategy. He became genuinely, personally fascinated by theology and philosophy. In 1575, he built something extraordinary at his capital Fatehpur Sikri, a building called the Ibadat Khana, the House of Worship. Here, he invited scholars from every major religion present in his empire and beyond, Sunni and Shia Muslim scholars, Hindu pundits, Zoroastrian priests, Jain monks, and even Jesuit Christian missionaries who had traveled from Portuguese Goa to sit together and debate theology directly in front of him. These debates often became fierce and heated. Akbar listened to all of them, for years, with what historians describe as genuine intellectual hunger rather than simple political calculation. Eventually, around 1582, Akbar formalized his own personal spiritual philosophy, which historians refer to as Din-i-Ilahi, the religion of God. It blended elements drawn from Islam, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and other traditions he had studied, centered around ideas of religious tolerance, rational inquiry, and loyalty to the emperor as a spiritual as well as political figure. It is crucial to understand, Din-i-Ilahi was never imposed on the empire. It was never a state religion forced onto his subjects. It functioned more as an elite philosophical movement among a small circle of close courtiers who chose to follow Akbar's spiritual path voluntarily. But the fact that an emperor of his power and scale even attempted something like this, inviting Jesuit priests to formally debate Islamic scholars at his own court in the 16th century, remains one of the most remarkable experiments in religious history. By the later decades of Akbar's reign, the Mughal Empire had become staggeringly wealthy. His finance minister, Raja Todar Mao, implemented a sophisticated land revenue system based on detailed surveys of crop yields and local prices. A system so effective and well-organized that later British colonial administrators in India would study and adapt parts of it centuries afterward. European travelers who visited Akbar's court left behind accounts describing wealth that genuinely stunned them. Detailed historical estimates suggest the Mughal Empire under Akbar accounted for a substantial share of total global economic output at the time. Some modern economic historians place Mughal India's share of world GDP in this era at roughly a quarter, an extraordinary figure by any standard. Akbar's capital cities, first Agra, then his purpose-built city of Fatehpur Sikri, were filled with architecture combining Persian, Indian, and Islamic styles into something entirely new. Markets overflowed with textiles, spices, and goods traded across a vast network stretching from Central Asia to the Indian Ocean trade routes. This was the foundation of what would later be called the Mughal Golden Age, a period of wealth, stability, and cultural production so significant that its architectural and administrative legacy would shape the Indian subcontinent for centuries afterward. When Akbar died in 1605, he left behind an empire utterly transformed from the one he had inherited as a 13-year-old boy. What had been a fragile, contested kingdom on the verge of collapse was now one of the wealthiest, most populous, and most administratively sophisticated empires on earth, built not purely through conquest, but through an extraordinary combination of military skill, religious tolerance, and political genius. Babur, the boy king who lost everything 3 times over, had planted a seed through a single afternoon of gunpowder tactics at Panipat. Akbar, the illiterate boy who could not read a single page, had grown that seed into one of the great empires of human history, through an approach to power that emphasized inclusion over domination, decades before most of the world even considered such an idea. From a homeless prince with 300 followers to an empire commanding roughly a quarter of the world's economic output. That is not just the rise of an empire. That is one of the most improbable success stories in human history. This is just the beginning of the Mughal story. After Akbar came Jahangir, then Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal, then Aurangzeb, under whom the empire reached its largest size before beginning its long decline. If you want that story next, let me know in the comments. Subscribe because Islamic history runs deep on this channel, and we are only getting started. Drop a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Babur's comeback or Akbar's religious experiment. See you in the next one.